There is something that has been bothering Steve Moore about the hair. Not the hair itself, not the analysis, not the 11 weeks in the Florida laboratory, or the transfer to Astria, or the progress being confirmed by sources close to the investigation. The framing. The public narrative around the forensic evidence in this case has been built around a single strand of hair. One hair. Found inside Nancy Guthrie's home. The hair has become the central character in the forensic story, the piece of evidence that will or won't produce a profile, that will or won't begin the genealogy process, that will or won't eventually lead investigators to a name. But Moore, a retired FBI supervisory special agent with 25 years of experience in exactly this kind of investigation, sat down with Brian Entin this week and asked a question that nobody in the mainstream coverage has been asking. What are the odds that there was only one hair? He said it directly. Imagine the odds of a person coming into a crime scene, losing only one hair, and you find it. That's not likely. If you find one hair, there are probably 10 others that you've missed. 10 others. That you've missed. From a crime scene that was processed by an inexperienced team in the first hours of February 1st, 2026. A crime scene that Sergeant Aaron Cross called a show. A crime scene that the FBI director later confirmed the Bureau was kept out of for 4 days. This is Forensic Disconnect. Day 109. And today we are going to cover something that has been sitting under the surface of this investigation for weeks and has not received enough analytical attention. The question of what else was at that crime scene. The question of what investigators actually have versus what they have publicly disclosed. And what Moore's theory, that one found hair almost certainly means more, tells us about the full forensic picture of a case that has been running for 109 days. Before we go further, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Day 109. Subscribe. Let me start with the Moore interview, because the full interview with Brian Entin covers more than the hair theory, and each part of it deserves attention. On the hair specifically, Moore's logic is simple and grounded in basic forensic science. Hair evidence at crime scenes is almost never singular. When a person enters a space, moves through it, touches surfaces, engages in any kind of physical activity, particularly the kind of physical activity that the blood evidence on Nancy's front stoop indicates occurred, they shed biological material. Hair, skin cells, fibers. The physical trace evidence of a human presence in a space is distributed across every surface that person contacted. The specific science behind this is called Locard's exchange principle. It was articulated by the French forensic scientist Edmond Locard in the early 20th century and has been the foundational principle of forensic investigation ever since. Locard's principle states that every contact leaves a trace. When two objects or persons come into contact, there is always a transfer of material from one to the other. The person who enters a space leaves something behind. The space leaves something on the person. The exchange is mutual, and it is unavoidable. At a violent crime scene, a scene where physical contact occurred between perpetrators and a victim, where a person was struck hard enough to produce the blood evidence that Jim Clemente analyzed on the front stoop, where someone was carried out of their home. The application of Locard's principle is specific and significant. The perpetrators left biological material in Nancy's home, not because they were careless, because physics requires it, because every contact leaves a trace. The question Moore is raising is not whether additional forensic evidence was collected. He is assuming it was. His question is whether all of the forensic evidence that was available at the scene was successfully collected given the specific conditions of the early investigation. And here is where the shit show matters forensically. Moore said that the confusion described by Cross, who said deputies encountered conflicting information from family members and communication breakdowns within the department, signals a deeper problem. You're not allowed to have confusion at a crime scene, Moore said. If there's confusion, it means nobody's in charge who knows what they're doing. A crime scene processed by people who don't know what they're doing is a crime scene that loses evidence. Not because the evidence wasn't there, because the people responsible for finding it didn't find it, because the collection protocols weren't followed correctly, because the chain of custody wasn't established properly, because the specific, methodical, trained-eye required process of forensic evidence collection was conducted by people who, in the words of their own union president, had never worked a homicide before. Moore was blunt. Imagine the odds of a person coming into a crime scene, losing only one hair, and you find it. That's not likely. If you find one hair, there are probably 10 others that you've missed. 10 others that you've missed at a crime scene that was processed by an inexperienced team. In the first hours of an investigation that the FBI director confirmed the Bureau was kept out of. The missed evidence is gone. There is no recovering hair evidence that was not collected in the first hours of the investigation. The perpetrators have not been back to deposit more. The crime scene has been released, re-entered, exposed to the weather and time. Whatever was there in the first hours is either in an evidence bag or it is gone. But here is the thing that Moore's logic implies that has not been said clearly. If the public narrative is built around one hair, and if Moore is right that one hair almost certainly means more were present, the investigation may have collected more than the one hair that has been publicly discussed. The public narrative is not necessarily the complete forensic inventory. Investigators do not disclose every piece of evidence they collect. The FBI director said as much when he talked about public trials versus public investigations. They protect what they have. Moore said that if investigators located even one hair inside the home, there are probably 10 more that have not been disclosed publicly. Not that they weren't there. Not that they weren't collected. That they have not been disclosed publicly. Because disclosing them publicly would give the perpetrator a roadmap of what investigators know, would tell them which surfaces were sampled, which areas of the house were processed, which specific pieces of evidence are in the investigative record. The single-hair narrative may be protective, a deliberate framing of the forensic picture that reveals one piece of evidence while keeping the rest private. And if that is what is happening, if the investigators have more than one hair, more than one DNA sample, more forensic evidence than the public has been told exists, the case is stronger than the public narrative suggests. Moore is raising this not to be optimistic. He is raising it because the show framing, the narrative of an incompetent early investigation that missed evidence and set the case back, may be partially correct and partially misleading. The incompetence was real. The evidence that was missed was real. But the evidence that was found may also be more substantial than the public has been told. Now let me talk about what Moore said about the getting closer statement. Because this is the other dimension of his interview that deserves attention, and it connects to the contradiction between Nanos's public statements and Entin's sourcing that has defined the accountability story of the past week. Moore was unconvinced that Nanos's "we're getting closer" statement carries much weight. I think he didn't feel like saying "same old, different day," the former agent said. I would need something more than that for it to mean anything significant to me. In a purely technical sense, Moore noted, investigators get closer every day simply by ruling people out or discarding dead-end leads. If you process a tip and determine it doesn't lead anywhere, you are technically closer to the answer because you have eliminated one wrong direction. Getting closer doesn't mean approaching the specific name. It means continuing the process of elimination that will eventually, through exhaustion of wrong answers, arrive at the right one. That framing, getting closer as the elimination of wrong answers rather than the approach of right ones, is the most honest description of where 109 days of investigation has left this case. The FBI has processed tens of thousands of tips. Each tip that goes nowhere is one less direction to explore. Each piece of evidence that doesn't match anyone in the databases narrows the universe. Each lead that dead ends makes the remaining leads more significant. But it is not the same as being close to an arrest. Nanos's statement, in Moore's reading, is technically true in the trivial sense that every day of investigation is a day closer to resolution, and not necessarily meaningful in the sense that most people hearing it would interpret it. Moore also addressed the leadership question directly. With recall efforts and political pressure mounting on Nanos, Moore was asked whether removing a sheriff mid-case could affect the investigation. He said removing a sheriff mid-case can temporarily slow progress, but could ultimately help if leadership was part of the problem. That is a careful and specific statement. It acknowledges the real risk, that any significant leadership transition in the middle of an active investigation creates disruption that takes time and resources to manage. But it also says that if the leadership was itself a problem, if the dysfunction described by Cross and the scolding described by Drewby and the unsworn letter and the perjury referral are symptoms of a leadership culture that is actively impeding the investigation, then removing that leadership could ultimately accelerate rather than slow the case. The investigation is at a point where those two considerations are in tension. Nanos's departure, if it comes through the recall in July or through other mechanisms, would disrupt the day-to-day management of an investigation that is in the middle of DNA analysis and blockchain tracing and genealogy work. But Nanos's continued presence means continued leadership from the person who sent the hair to the wrong lab, who scolded the county assessor for cooperating with the FBI, who submitted an unsworn letter to the Board of Supervisors, whose department was described as a sure show by its own union president. Neither option is clean. Both have costs. And the investigation continues under whoever is in charge because the forensic processes at Astria and in the FBI's blockchain analytics office are not dependent on who is in Nanos's chair. Now let me talk about what Moore said about body recovery. Because this dimension of his interview, what happens to the investigation if Nancy's remains are ever found, is the part that has received the least coverage and that deserves specific attention. Moore argued that the case could shift dramatically if Nancy's remains are ever recovered. He said the location alone would offer another treasure trove of evidence, from tire tracks and footprints to environmental markers that could narrow down where the suspect traveled and how. Treasure trove of evidence. Those words are specific. They reflect a specific forensic reality about what the discovery of remains in a case like this produces that goes far beyond the confirmation of death. The location where remains are found is a crime scene in itself. If Nancy's body was transported from her home and deposited somewhere, in the desert, in a specific geographic location, in a way that reflects the perpetrator's knowledge of the terrain and their calculation about what would and wouldn't be found, that location contains evidence of the transportation. Tire tracks from the vehicle that brought her there, footprints from the person who deposited her, environmental trace evidence that connects the location to the perpetrator, and potentially biological evidence from the perpetrators themselves deposited at the secondary scene in ways that the primary scene at Nancy's home may not have captured. In his experience, Moore suggested kidnappers rarely travel 100 miles one direction to dispose of a body before heading straight back. Geography, he suggested, will matter. Geography will matter. That phrase is the investigative framework for what C.C. Moore has been saying since February. The second crime scene must exist. Wherever Nancy was taken, she and the perpetrators occupied a shared space. And that space is somewhere in the geographic reality of southern Arizona, within a range that is consistent with what a person can drive in a specific amount of time, in a specific direction, without attracting attention. The desert around Tucson is vast, but it is not infinite. And the specific geographic logic of where a body could be deposited, accessible by vehicle, likely within an hour or two of the crime scene, in terrain that the perpetrator knew well enough to use deliberately, narrows the search radius to something that a systematic search could eventually cover. The YouTube streamers are already searching parts of that terrain. AJ found a prehistoric bone at Craycroft and River. The Madres Buscadoras de Sonora have been searching the desert south of the border. The Catalyst Center, a nonprofit that uses ground-penetrating technology to search for human remains, has been working in the area. None of them have found Nancy, but the search continues. And Moore's specific point, that geography will matter when remains are eventually found, gives that continuing search a specific forensic significance. The location is not just about closure. It is evidence. Now let me be honest about what Day 109 looks like from the outside. No named suspect, no arrest, no confirmed second crime scene, no body. The DNA is at Estrella and progress has been reported but not fully disclosed. The blockchain trail is being followed. The genealogy process is waiting for the profile. The 911 calls are protected. The evidence that would light a fire is being held. The motive is known and withheld, and the sheriff is no longer talking to the family. The board decided not to take action. The recall needs signatures. The perjury referral is at the Department of Justice. Moore said it honestly. Getting closer in the technical sense, eliminating wrong answers, narrowing the field every single day. But not close to an arrest in the sense that the public hears when the sheriff says we're getting closer. Enton said it too. Not much closer. But it can change in a second. That is where 109 days has left this. Not failed, not finished. In the specific, invisible, unglamorous middle of a long-form federal investigation that moves at the pace that the science and the law and the evidence require. Moore noted that locating Guthrie's remains, even months later, could still provide critical clues such as tire tracks, soil patterns, or additional DNA. The search continues. The science is moving, and the person who has been watching every segment and calculating their safety for 109 days has not fully calculated what Steve Moore said on the Enton interview this week. If you find one hair, there are probably 10 more. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI, 1-800-225-5324. Submit tips at tips.fbi.gov. Call the Pima County Sheriff's Department at 520-351-4900. The combined reward is over $1 million. Completely anonymous. Hit the like button. Subscribe to Forensic Disconnect. Drop a comment. Do you think the investigators have more forensic evidence than they've publicly disclosed? We read every single comment. Day 109. One hair means 10 more. We will be back tomorrow. Let me go deeper into Locard's exchange principle and what it means specifically for this crime scene. Because most true crime coverage mentions DNA and hair evidence without explaining the underlying science that makes Moore's 10 more hairs argument so forensically grounded. Edmond Locard was a French forensic scientist who worked in the early 20th century. He was the director of the world's first police crime laboratory, established in Lyon, France, in 1910. His work helped transform criminal investigation from an art into a science. From the intuition-based detection of fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes into the systematic, evidence-based methodology of modern forensics. His exchange principle is elegantly simple. Every physical contact between two objects or persons results in a transfer of material from each to the other. The transfer may be microscopic. It may be invisible to the naked eye. It may require sophisticated analytical techniques to detect and identify. But it always happens. The contact always leaves a trace. At a crime scene involving human activity, the application of this principle is comprehensive. A person who walks through a space leaves footwear impressions, however faint. A person who touches a surface leaves fingerprints, however partial. A person who is present in a room for an extended period of time sheds skin cells. A person who makes physical contact with another person transfers fibers, hair, and biological material in both directions, from themselves to the other person and from the other person to themselves. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the physical evidence of the crime tells us that significant physical contact occurred. The blood on the front stoop, the expirated blood that Jim Clemente analyzed as coughed from the airways after a blow, is the record of a violent physical encounter. Someone struck Nancy hard enough that blood entered her airways. She went to the ground. She was lifted and carried. These are not the actions of a person who touched a surface briefly and moved on. These are the actions of a person who was in close physical contact with Nancy Guthrie for an extended period. Every second of that contact was an exchange. Every moment of that physical encounter was a transfer of material in both directions. Nancy's DNA went on to the perpetrator. The perpetrator's DNA went on to Nancy and onto the surfaces around her. The question is not whether that exchange occurred. Locard's principle makes the occurrence certain. The question is whether investigators successfully collected the evidence of that exchange from the crime scene before the crime scene was released, re-entered, or contaminated. A well-trained crime scene investigator knows where to look. They know that hair evidence is concentrated in specific areas, at the points of most significant contact, in the areas where the victim was held or carried or struggled, on the surfaces that the perpetrator's clothing or body contacted. They know that touch DNA, the DNA left by skin cells on surfaces that were touched, is concentrated at specific functional points. The door handles, the light switches, the flower pots that were used to prop open the back doors, the specific areas that anyone moving through that house that night would have touched deliberately. A crime scene processed by people who are encountering their first homicide, the specific situation that Cross described in his account of the early investigation may not know where to look with the same systematic confidence. They may collect obvious evidence and miss the less obvious. They may document certain areas thoroughly and overlook others. They may prioritize the visible and miss the invisible. This is not a criticism of individual detectives. It is a documented reality of crime scene investigation. Experience matters. Training matters. The specific expertise of a team that has processed dozens of violent crime scenes is different from the expertise of a team processing its first one. And the show conditions that Cross described, the confusion, the communication breakdowns, the lack of coordination, are exactly the conditions under which evidence gets missed. Moore's probably 10 more hairs argument is not pessimism about what investigators found. It is realism about the odds that everything that was there was collected. And it is optimism about what the investigators may have that they haven't publicly disclosed. Because if the collection was imperfect, if some evidence was missed, that doesn't mean all of it was missed. Some of the 10 hairs were probably found. Some of the skin cells were probably swabbed. Some of the fiber evidence was probably collected. And whatever was collected that has not been publicly disclosed is part of the investigative record that is building toward the moment when it can be presented in a courtroom. The evidence picture in this case is not just what the public has been told exists. It is whatever was collected from that crime scene in the first hours of February 1st and in the subsequent collection efforts over the following days. The specific inventory of what investigators have is known only to the investigators. And Moore is saying that inventory is almost certainly larger than the single hair narrative suggests. Now let me talk about why this matters for the genealogy process specifically. Because the genealogy process that C.C. Moore is waiting to begin at Estrella is not limited to a single hair. It can be applied to any piece of biological material that contains sufficient nuclear DNA to generate a partial profile. A hair shaft with no root, the type of hair found at crime scenes because rooted hairs are only shed when pulled, contains mitochondrial DNA and small amounts of nuclear DNA. The nuclear DNA content is low compared to a rooted hair or a blood sample, which is why the SNP profiling process required to extract a profile from rootless hair is more technically demanding and takes longer. But skin cells left on a surface, touch DNA, also contain nuclear DNA, at lower quantities than blood or saliva, but potentially enough for the specific type of analysis that has advanced significantly in recent years. A swab from a surface that was touched by the perpetrator could contain touch DNA that, with the right analytical approach, could generate a partial profile comparable to what the hair is producing. If investigators have swabs from touch DNA surfaces in addition to the hair, if they collected evidence from the door handles, the flower pots, the back doors, the specific areas that anyone moving through that house that night would have touched, they may have multiple biological samples that are all pointing toward the same profile. The genealogy process does not require a single perfect sample. It requires a profile sufficient to begin the family tree comparison. And multiple imperfect samples, analyzed together, can produce a profile that none of them could produce individually. The single-hair narrative may be underselling the forensic foundation of this case, and Moore is raising that possibility not to generate optimism, but to correct the record. 1 hair means probably 10 more. 10 more means a more robust forensic picture than the public has been told. A more robust forensic picture means the evidence is stronger than it appears from the outside. Day 109. The forensic picture is bigger than 1 hair. The investigators know it. Moore knows it. And the person who has been calculating their safety based on the public narrative of a single-hair forensic challenge may not know exactly how much more the investigators actually have. That gap between what the perpetrator thinks investigators have and what investigators actually have is one of the most powerful tools in a long-form criminal investigation. The blockchain trail is permanent. The hair at Estrella is almost certainly not the only biological evidence. The 10 more hairs may be sitting in evidence bags in a federal laboratory right now, and the genealogy process that starts with 1 profile ends with a name. Day 109. 1 hair means 10 more. The investigation is building toward the moment when that matters. And then today, something happened that put everything in a different frame. Jon Ramsey appeared on Brian Entin Investigates. Jon Ramsey is the father of JonBenéт Ramsey, the 6-year-old girl found murdered in the family's Boulder, Colorado home on December 26, 1996. A case that has never been solved. A case in which the local police department, the Boulder Police Department, spent years investigating the victim's own family, while the evidence pointing elsewhere went inadequately pursued. A case in which help was offered and refused, in which experienced resources were available and not used, in which a local department without homicide expertise handled a high-profile murder investigation and came up short in ways that have never been corrected. Jon Ramsey knows what it looks like from inside a family when a local police department is not doing what it should be doing. He knows it with a specificity that no expert commentator, no retired FBI agent, no criminologist can match. He knows it because he lived it, because his daughter's killer has never been identified, because the case remains open 30 years later. And he sat down with Brian Entin today and said things about the Nancy Guthrie investigation that, coming from him specifically, carry a weight that nothing else in the public record of this case carries. He said, "Don't assume the police are doing everything they can do. They may be, but don't assume that. Don't assume they know what they're doing. They may, but don't assume that. And really scrutinize what they're doing. Ask questions. Don't assume they know what they're doing." From the father of JonBenéт Ramsey to the family of Nancy Guthrie, on day 109. He also said something more specific, something that connects his daughter's case to this one with a precision that is impossible to miss. He said police didn't seek help from people who knew what they were doing in the early days of the investigation, and then he said, "It seemed like there was a little bit of a battle between the sheriff and the FBI, and the sheriff kind of wanting to handle it himself. A battle between the sheriff and the FBI. A sheriff wanting to handle it himself." In 1996, the Boulder Police Department turned down 3 experienced homicide detectives offered by the Denver Police Department. Boulder had no homicide detective. The department that was handling the most significant murder case in its recent history had no one on staff who had worked a homicide before. And they turned down the experienced help that was offered. Ramsey said, "I got a feeling that may have been the case in the Guthrie case, too." That parallel, drawn by the person who has the most specific standing to draw it, the person who watched his own daughter's case go cold in part because of exactly this dynamic, is the most devastating thing said publicly about the management of this investigation since the FBI director confirmed the Bureau was kept out for 4 days. A man whose daughter's murderer has never been identified, 30 years later. Because the local department didn't seek help from people who knew what they were doing. Telling the family of a missing 84-year-old woman, "Don't assume the police are doing everything they can do." Ramsey also said something specific about the DNA that connects directly to Moore's 10 more hairs argument and to the full forensic picture of this case. He urged the family to ask specifically about the status of the DNA evidence. He urged them to ask whether investigators are using investigative genetic genealogy, the C.C. Moore framework, the Astrea laboratory process, the SNP profiling technology that produces a profile from rootless hair, rather than simply relying on the traditional CODIS database that has produced no match. He said, "It's like when you're in a hospital, you have to have an advocate. Make sure the nurses and doctors are doing everything that can be done for the person you're advocating for." An advocate. Someone asking the questions that the family cannot always ask because they are inside the grief and the uncertainty and the ache and the wonder. Someone making sure that every available resource is being applied. Someone scrutinizing what the police are doing rather than assuming it is sufficient. The Guthrie family has been, in many ways, exactly that advocate. Savannah's public statements, the family's tip line messages, the reward fund, the sustained public presence that has kept this case in the national news cycle for 109 days. They have been advocating. They have been scrutinizing. They have been asking questions. What Ramsey is saying, and from the specific position of someone whose family also scrutinized, also asked questions, also did everything a family can do, is that scrutiny is necessary but not sufficient. That asking the questions is essential, but that the answers the department gives may not tell the full story. That the battle between the sheriff and the FBI, the sheriff wanting to handle it himself, the resistance to outside resources, all of that requires not just asking questions but demanding honest answers to them. The parallel between Boulder in 1996 and Tucson in 2026 is not exact. The technologies are different. The investigative resources available are different. The FBI's involvement, however delayed and however contested, is a different dynamic from Boulder's refusal of Denver's homicide detectives. The JonBenét's case remains unsolved 30 years later. The Nancy Guthrie case is 109 days old with active federal forensic processes running. But the structural parallel, local department, high-profile case, resources available that the local leadership resisted using, battle between local and federal, is specific enough that the person who lived through the JonBenét's version felt it was important to name it publicly on national media today. Don't assume the police are doing everything they can do. The man who has 30 years of evidence that they don't always do that said it. To this family, today. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI, 1-800-225-5324. Submit tips at tips.fbi.gov. Call the Pima County Sheriff's Department at 520-351-4900. The combined reward is over $1 million, completely anonymous. Hit the like button. Subscribe to Forensic Disconnect. Drop a comment. What do you think about John Ramsey's warning to the Guthrie family? Does the parallel between JonBenét's and Nancy concern you? We read every single comment. Day 109. The father of JonBenét's just said, "Don't assume they know what they're doing. We will be back tomorrow."